But it does actually bring up an interesting question, right? Excuse me, how do we know that a phenomenon is truly supernatural? How do we know if something supernatural truly exists, right? Because what an atheist will generally say is that there's no evidence that anything supernatural exists, right? That's what they always say, which is not true, right? We're going to talk more about what I mean by that. I actually forgot to mention, this idea of supernatural fallacy, we're going to discuss mainly the ideas related to it in this video. We're going to discuss about half of the ideas related to it in this video, but then we're going to discuss the other half in the next video, right? So it would have just been too long to kind of put in one video, but we're going to what I really want to do in this video, I want to approach this idea of the supernatural more from a scientific perspective, right? And it kind of is going to take, like I said, it's going to take about 2 videos to do that. One half in this video and one half in the next video. And so what you'll generally hear from atheists, is that the concept of supernatural and science doesn't mix, not true, right? But that's what they'll tell you. They'll tell you that nothing has scientifically been proven, no supernatural event has scientifically been proven. Now, here's what I want to make clear. So what I want to do is, like I said, I want to set up a standard. I want to kind of try to understand and set up a standard to understand and analyze supernatural events. Because when they say science has never demonstrated anything supernatural, technically, that could be true depending on how you define science, right? And because some people define science as science is a process for obtaining information, right? Generally through scientific method, collecting data, verifying it through setting up a theory and verifying it through experimentation. That experimentation should be reproducible, things like that, right? So that's generally what science is, but primarily all those ideas are related to empirical data related to the physical world, right? So it's very important. It's about obtaining information about the physical reality, right? Now, some people don't consider any type of process for obtaining information about anything that isn't representative of the direct physical reality. It's not science. Some people can say that's just their definition. Like they wouldn't consider psychology science or sociology, because even though those are outgrowths of physical phenomena, which is our brain, right? They're not directly studying matter, right? They're just studying things that you really can't explain in terms of, it's not directly related strictly to the interaction of matter. So some people don't consider it to be science. Understood, no problem. I don't really actually have a problem with some people who have that kind of definition of science. I don't, right? I think science there's more of a spiritual, not spiritual, right? But there's more of I like to refer more to the spirit of what I think science is. The spirit of science, all it really is this like motivation to obtain the truth about reality. That's it. And you want to try to do it in an objective way. That's the spirit of science, right? It's just kind of hard to apply that to non-physical phenomena. So sometimes it's just limited purely to physical phenomena. No problem. I understand that, right? I could totally get with that, right? But in this video, I want to talk about the idea of science. So I'm going to be using, when I say science, I'm going to be using that probably in a looser way than scientists generally mean it. But I'm referring to more so the spirit of science. So what I want to do now is I want to now set up a kind of epistemological standard that's going to help us to study supernatural phenomena and study them, or try to study them more from the context of science, right? So why do I feel the need to do that? Why not just go straight into it? Well, because this is something I know as atheists always do, is atheists will always kind of play fast and loose with what it means to know something. They always do this, right? So an atheist will say, if you present any type of evidence to an atheist, some type of experience or some type of phenomena you think might be supernatural, they'll say that's not evidence. You don't really know if this happened. You don't really know what's going on. You don't know if God really spoke to you. How do you know it wasn't delusion or something like that? They'll always do this, right? And what they're really doing in these instances, it's very subtle, it's very slick, right? But I picked up on what's going on, is atheists will kind of change their standard of what it means to know something, right? And obviously they're going to increase the standard to a very high bar when it comes to anything supernatural because of their need for it not to be true. In other words, they engage in order to engage in their denialism, there has to be nothing supernatural in order for atheism to be true. What they'll do is just increase the bar of what it means to know something. How do you know, right? First of all, what I want to make clear here is that no one can know anything, right? No one could. What atheists conflate, right, is it the ability to doubt something with the ability to know something. It's perfectly possible for me to know something and still have the ability to doubt it. Doubt it's true. I could doubt I'm in this room right now, right? I could make up some reason, maybe I'm in the Matrix, or maybe this is a dream. Relative to some standard, I'm probably not really here, right? I could be in the most clear situation where it is more clear than anything that I'm here and this is happening, and I can still doubt it, right? So is it possible for me to know something so well that I just can't doubt it? I don't think so, right? That would be like just taking away my free will. So atheists conflate the ability to doubt something with the ability to know something. They're two separate things. In my free will, I always have the ability to doubt. It makes no difference, right, how much something is true or how much I want to believe something's true. But even more than that, going further than that, what atheists will do, or what I want to do now is look at I know his name is Descartes. I call him Descartes because that's what it looks like. So that's what I called him as a kid. So he demonstrated that the only thing we can realistically know, if we're giving a rational argument, the only thing we can absolutely know for sure is that we exist. That's pretty much it, right? There's nothing else I can truly know for sure, at least if I'm giving a rational argument. I could doubt pretty much anything. I can't really doubt that I exist. I can do it, but I can't do it through a rational argument, in my opinion. Right? So that's it. So it's very bare bones, right? There's really nothing we can know for sure, right? I can't know the sun is going to come up tomorrow. It's been doing that before I was born, and every day since I've been born. There's no reason to believe it won't happen tomorrow, but I still don't know. How do I know if it comes up tomorrow I'm not being deceived or something, right? So I can always come up with some nonsense to sort of establish that I don't really know something for sure. Of course not. Nobody can know something for sure, especially if they have free will and they could just choose to doubt something. So when atheists say that, just kind of recognize that that's what they're doing. They're just playing fast and loose with the term knowing, right? No one can know anything. They can't know anything, right? But I'm going to address that. So an atheist might hear that and say, exactly, but we're not making a claim to know. Yes, you are, right? Like I said in the last video, when you say that something isn't evidence of God, that's a positive claim which requires defense. Why isn't this marker right here evidence of God? Show me that this marker, it's reasonable to believe that this marker could exist without a being who exists with the property that they created the universe. Demonstrate that, right? So that's a positive claim, and they always try to get around that. But so what I want to do now is say, actually I was going to move forward, but what I meant to say was that when we say we know something in everyday language, what we're really saying is that we are able to justify our belief that something is true relative to some epistemological standard, right? We can't really know anything relative to the absolute standard. I would say the absolute human standard, which like I said before, is really the only thing we can know for sure is that we exist. That's it, right? In that sense, you can say that's the absolute standard of knowing for the human condition. Excuse me. But when we use the term knowing every day, we don't sort of change the language and things like that because we can't really know. No, of course not. Only atheists do that, right? Well, when we say we know something, we're always saying we know that relative to some standard, relative to some epistemological standard, which according to that standard, we can at least justify our beliefs. So we just say we know it, right? I know the sun will come up tomorrow relative to the epistemological standard of science, right? Or in science and experience, really. It doesn't even have to be science, right? And I trust in that standard. Now, there are different standards that you can say you know something relative to, and some of them are scientific and some of them aren't, right? So I could say, I know, right, that I had some experience with that when I was a kid. No problem, right? And that might be valid for me, but it won't be valid for someone else because they didn't have the experience. They don't know what I'm talking about. They can't verify what I said. So that standard wouldn't be science, right? That standard might be good for me, but it's not good for someone else. right? If I make the claim about myself. So what I want to now do is set up a standard, right? Epistemological standard that we can say that we know an event is supernatural relative to, right? Not in the absolute way, in the relative way. By the way, atheists do the same thing, right? So when something, they will say they know that physics is true and they know that all this stuff happened relative to a particular standard, but they always increase the standard when it comes to God or supernatural stuff. So what's a good standard we can use for studying supernatural phenomena, and what's a standard we can use that really encapsulate the spirit of what science is? Well, in order to set that up, what I want to do first is I want to establish a clear definition of what a supernatural phenomenon is, or a supernatural event. Right, so I like to set up very clear and concise definitions, or at least I like to work from a clear and concise definition when I'm setting up some type of logical analysis, right? So what is a supernatural event, right? Well, to explain that, first I want to just make it clear that I'm going to be working from a dualist model of reality. So a dualist model of reality just says that there exists a material realm or a physical world, and there exists the spiritual world, right? So the spirit realm and the physical realm. And a supernatural event is some event that can't possibly be explained without sort of talking about the mechanics of the spirit realm, right? So that's a very simple definition, right? So you can only kind of understand it if you're appealing to the appealing to occurrences in the spirit realm, right? Now there could be some event that has to be explained both in the terms of the mechanics of the physical realm and the spirit realm. But it has to at least be the case you can't possibly explain it without talking about mechanics in the spirit realm. So that's what a supernatural event is, right? A physical event is an event that can pretty much fully be explained without appealing to any supernatural or any of the mechanics of the spirit realm. So now how would we analyze supernatural events, right? Because it's very difficult to sort of talk about spirit realm things and the mechanics and things. We're actually going to talk about a lot of that later in the chapters. But for the moment, let's say it's very difficult to understand what goes on in the spirit realm and how that works and things like that, right? It's very easy to analyze things in the physical realm. So how do we truly know when something is supernatural? Well, there is one property based on that definition that it should have. And that's this one here. And to go over it, it says, a supernatural event must at least have the property that it can't be explained in terms of physical laws. And that's a tautology, right? That's a tautology that's established based on the definition, right? So a supernatural event is an event that has certain behaviors, that can't be explained without appealing to the mechanics of the spirit realm, right? So in other words, I can't explain it in terms of physical laws because I'm now just sticking to the mechanics of the physical realm, right? So now this is not a complete sort of, this doesn't prove that the event is supernatural, to be clear, right? There have been many events in history, even ones we still see today, that aren't really, well, I don't want to use ones we consider today because, an atheist would say anything's physical, right? But just there are many events in history that we weren't able to explain that at one point were considered to be supernatural. And then later, as we gain more science and learn more things, we realized it wasn't supernatural, right? So there was a time where I can imagine, people saw lightning in the sky and thought the gods were fighting or something, right? Or when people got sick, they assumed the gods were throwing a plague on mankind or something like that, right? So that they couldn't explain it in terms of physical laws, so they thought maybe it was a supernatural event, right? But it wasn't, right? So we realized that wasn't the case. However, it did have the property that it couldn't be explained by their understanding of physical laws at the time. So it was possible for it to be a supernatural event, right? So again, we're going to expand on this a little bit more, but we can at least attribute this property to supernatural events, right? They at least have this property. Again, it's not proof that it is supernatural, but it's a good candidate for something that's possibly supernatural. So the next property I want to discuss regarding supernatural claims. So in order for us to study things that are supernatural, it has to have this property, but then I also wanted to have this property, right? So this property is kind of strong on its own, but I want it to be a little bit stronger. And so this property is really what brings the science part into it. So when we say we know something in science, right? And I talked about this just a moment ago. When we say we know something in science, we're always talking about relative to some standard, relative to some epistemological standard, right? A framework in epistemology, that says if we follow these series of steps in good faith, right, then the conclusion can generally be trusted to have to be a good source of knowledge or have a good chunk of knowledge in it, even if there's some inaccuracies, right? And the epistemology they follow in science is generally scientific method, right? But still, science does still follow some type of epistemological standard. So when we say we know atoms exist, we know electricity is the motion of electrons, we know energy is conserved, right? There are conditions where it's not conserved, but for the moment, we'll just say we know that energy is conserved, right? We're saying we know this relative to some standard, right? So I want to really expand upon that and kind of go a little bit deeper. I want it to be a little bit more philosophical because science is about really setting up that standard for physical things. But I want to kind of have a similar standard. Like I said, I want to encapsulate the spirit of science, but I want to have a more generalized standard for gaining knowledge. So to go over this point, it says, when we claim to know something about the nature of reality, so physical or metaphysical, we must have a theory that makes verifiable predictions or furthermore, one's associated experience of verification must match up with the experience of others. So very important. So that's the epistemological standard I want to use when making claims about the supernatural. In other words, if something is supernatural, then it should follow the same standard in science. By the way, this is also the standard they follow in science. In science, if I say I know something in science, that means I have a theory about it. That theory is able to make predictions. I can verify if those predictions are true through experiment. My experience in the process of verifying that prediction must match up with the experience of others. So for example, if I throw a ball, right, and there's no other forces on it, it's going to follow a parabolic path and go to the floor. Now, that theory is predicted by Newton's laws. That motion, that behavior is predicted by Newton's laws, right? So when I throw it, I experience the ball. I can see it doing this and then doing that. So that's my experience of verifying Newton's law, right? So that's a theory. It makes a prediction. I have a particular experience verifying it. And other people should have that same experience when they're verifying Newton's law. So they should throw a ball and also see it doing this, right? So that experience, my experience matches up with the experience of others, right? We describe it the same way when we are verifying Newton's laws by throwing it somewhere or throwing it in a particular way. So relative to this, if it all meets that standard, then we can say we know something, right? If one of those things isn't happening, then we can't really say we know it. If I throw the ball and it does this, and someone else throws the ball and it does this, something's off, right? The theory, something about this theory is wrong, or something the person did was wrong. Something's wrong, right? And so we need to sort of analyze things to sort of understand what happened. If we're able to properly test whether what we know is true, right? So that's the standard they follow in science. But you can also follow the same standard with supernatural events, right? Now, I'm going to analyze this from that perspective more so in the next video, because there's a lot more to say about that. But I'm not going to go into it in this video. In this video, I want to really talk about these supernatural events themselves. So what I want to now go into is I want to now talk about how atheists approach supernatural phenomena and the epistemology that they generally use, right? Because basically what I'm saying here is that you can use these sort of standards or these sort of epistemological properties, if you will. You can use these to now understand supernatural phenomena. You have a way of studying them and making sense of them. And by the way, that's what I did, right? So that's what I did with the subconscious mind. That's what I did with God, right? So in my relationship with Jesus Christ, praying to him and controlling my subconscious. We're going to talk more about that stuff later. I learned more about God and more about the supernatural in this very simple sort of process, right? So I set up a theory about these things. I had certain observations throughout my life, and as it relates to me praying to God, as it relates to my subconscious. and I had certain observations, then made a theory, I tested those predictions, and then I was able to show that those predictions match up with the experience of others. So that fits the epistemological standard, and they can't be explained in terms of physical laws, right? So they're likely to be supernatural according to the standard. I'll actually explain more about what I mean by that in a moment. But what atheists do, and I can do that because I believe in a dualist model of reality, because that's true. The reality actually does exist as a dualist model. What atheists do is they don't believe in a dualist model of reality. They believe in a materialist model. Now, the materialist model is clearly wrong, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to lead to them constantly making predictions that fail all the time and aren't able to explain things, which is what happens with atheists, right? And to go over this next point, it says, atheists generally do not require verifiable predictions for their materialist beliefs. So this is actually an interesting thing that I've noticed with atheists, and this has to be true because it really goes back to here. If reality does actually exist as a dualist model, then the materialist model is obviously going to fail in its predictions all the time, which is what happens with them. But you also, if you're an atheist, you need reality to be a materialist model in order for your beliefs to exist, right? You have to accept that they're probably false if the supernatural exists. So you have to cling to this idea that nothing's supernatural. Then how do you deal with this problem of when you see certain events that seem to be pretty much supernatural in the predictions you're making that should happen if reality was material? Well, how do you deal with the problem of those predictions failing all the time? Well, I'll actually go through it here. So to deal with the problem of predictive failure, atheists appeal to a science of gaps argument, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm actually going to explain what I mean by the science of gaps in a moment, but I actually want to back up for a moment because this is another one of those kind of fast and loose things that atheists do that I've noticed, right? So what they will often do is they will, like I said, because their theory of reality or their theories about reality are based on a materialist model, which is wrong, right? So it leads to problems or failures all the time. So they're not able to make predictions regarding anything supernatural. But here's what they do. What they will always do is sort of take some prediction, right? They have a theory of reality, so they will take some prediction about the supernatural event, and when some of it kind of appears to be true, they will use that to claim it as their own and say, well, look, like our theory proved this is true. So they try to claim some supernatural event as their own, right? If you believe in supernatural, you have to find some other event, right? Because we claim this. No, right? It's this fast and loose thing they play with predicting things. So what's a good example of that? Well, a good example has to do with emotions or consciousness, which we're actually going to talk about that in a moment. But so I've been actually we've been talking about the nature of emotions throughout the whole book, right? Throughout the whole series, book 1. Right, mainly throughout book 1. So we talked about how it works. We talked about how it comes from the subconscious. We presume the subconscious is metaphysical. We're able to make predictions. We have set up a theory about the nature of emotions, and we're able to use that theory to make predictions. You could observe that those predictions appear to be true in the behaviors of others, so it perfectly follows this standard, and you can't fully explain it in terms of purely physical laws. So it's perfect, right? It perfectly meets the epistemological standard that was set up to try to explain something as being likely supernatural, right? But here's what atheists do. So when you tell them that, they'll say, oh no, we can explain emotions in terms of the brain and this and that. And like I said, I was going to kind of get into it a little more later, but please, right, if you ask, first of all, it's exactly, I think I mentioned it before in book 1, there have been many different theories on emotions, right? There's James Lang, Canon Bard, Singer Shatner, something like that. There's many different ones. But here's the thing, nobody in psychology or science or neuroscience completely agrees on how emotions work. You know why? Because they're based on a materialist model. So there's always going to be some missing component to them. They're always going to be off. They can't really properly make predictions about emotions because their theory is wrong, right? Now you would think after all this time of being wrong and all these events that they can't explain, you would think that would just convince them, or it'd be a standard practice in science, in orthodox science, to just accept that maybe the consciousness or emotions have a metaphysical component to them, right? And we need to create a theory that makes predictions regarding the metaphysical component. Of course, they don't do that. But here's what they do. They will generally say, like, we can make some predictions, right? So if we know if you release certain hormones or neurotransmitters in the brain, then you will experience emotions in a particular way. If certain, which we already talked about that in chapter 4, if certain sections of the brain, like the amygdala, right, if they get more active, right, you may experience more of a fight or flight response or become more aggressive or something like that. So we know that when the brain gets damaged, then it'll change your emotional sort of state to some degree, or your sort of affinity for certain emotions. So they will use that to say this proves the materialist model. No, it doesn't. You know why? Because the materialist model the dualist model also makes those predictions, right? The dualist model also says that the brain affects consciousness, affects emotions in certain ways, right? And if the brain gets damaged, these things will happen. What the atheist likes to do is they like to take a theory that they can verify through the materialist, they like to have a theory about certain supernatural phenomena, and they can verify some of the event through a materialist explanation, and because they can only verify some, they'll just say it's all materialist. No, it isn't. The dualist model said the same thing would happen. In order for your theory to be true, you have to make a prediction that deviates from the dualist model. In other words, the dualist model says this will, exactly at the point the dualist model says this would happen, your theory says this would happen. That's what you would do to prove that your theory is correct over the dualist model. Not just make some prediction the dualist model also makes, right? They always do that, right? But no, right? So, and I like I said, I've debated many atheists, and I saw that they do that all the time. And if you could watch their videos online, you'll see them do the same thing. When it comes to actually making a prediction that deviates from the dualist model, it always fails. It fails I've never seen a single sort of prediction that atheists will make. Because like I said, I actually have a theoretical model for the metaphysical realm. So I have a theory that easily makes predictions all the time, right? So all I have to do, I can pinpoint exactly where the materialist prediction deviates from when the prediction of the materialist model deviates from the predictions of the dualist model. Now, I don't know enough about materials, to be fair. I'm not a neuroscientist and things like that. But I feel like I know enough to pinpoint for certain claims exactly where the deviation occurs. And when you look at that deviation, you'll see the materialist model always fails. I've never seen one prediction. It's not like I'm saying, well, majority of predictions of the dualist model succeed, but to be fair, some predictions of the materialist model succeed and the dualist model fails. Never happened once, right? It literally is only one, it happens in one direction. The second you get to the point of deviation, the dualist model wins every single time. Never seen it and not happen one time, right? And so that's what I mean by this is a fundamental problem with the atheist model of materialism, because it's wrong, right? So anytime they make a prediction that actually deviates from the theory of the dualist model, it always fails. So how do you deal with that failure problem, right? And just to give an example, we already talked about it actually with emotions, right? So in science, there are many things they cannot understand or explain regarding emotions. For example, they don't really know what causes depression. They don't really know why depression, like taking pills for depression, works sometimes and doesn't work other times. We have a theory on that. We talked about that in chapter 14. I was able to verify that theory. And there's so much more as it relates to God and things like that, which we're going to talk about later in the chapters, right? And so you see many events that support my theory or the dualist model of reality. Happens all the time, right? Now, whenever things like that, like so for just as an example, there are many people, I talk a little more about this, I think in chapter 5. In this book, there are many people who notice when they come to Jesus Christ and they develop a relationship with God that they start to feel better. They feel more fulfilled. Something feels different in a very good way that they can't quite put their finger on. Now, this happens often enough that you can't just dismiss it in the way they always do. It's just some random thing that happened in someone's head and they were hallucinating or this and that, right? They always say that, right? But it happens so often that it really can't just be dismissed. Something is happening here. Now, in the dualist model of reality can explain that perfectly. And I can even go so much further, right? Again, we'll talk about that stuff later. The atheist model cannot. Why? Because they believe in materialism. There's nothing supernatural. There is no God or any of that, right? So when you see all of those events, you have to dismiss it, right? It didn't really happen. There's always, and this is what atheists always do. Every time they're presented with some event that seems supernatural, there was always some reason why whatever happened didn't really happen. They always got an excuse. I actually like to say that there are three things in life that are certain, right? Death, taxes, and atheist excuses. Right? So that, I think Benjamin Franklin says the first two, death and taxes. But I add on the third part, death, taxes, and atheist excuses. They've always got an excuse for why their material model failed. It never ends. I've seen it so many times. When I'm debating them, I'll just mention all this stuff, right? I'll say all these things, which we're actually going to get into that later in the video. But every time you present the seemingly supernatural phenomena, which really can't be explained in terms of physical laws, they'll always dismiss it with some excuse that doesn't make any sense, some sort of half-cocked, kind of lazy analysis that doesn't explain anything. All you did was come up with some sort of nonsense to try to dismiss it in order to cling to your material model of reality, right? And like I said, it happens all the time. Their theory always fails. And so what they'll usually do, and this is kind of the mantra of atheism, as I've come to understand it, what they'll always do when presented with something they can't explain, and this is why I call it science of gaps, they will always say science is still figuring it out, right? That's their favorite excuse, right? So for example, if you ask them, well, how do emotions work? Why can't, like for me, I actually taught you guys how the theory behind emotions, how they work. You can manipulate them at will using your intention. If you want to do this with your emotion, you can do it. If you want to do this with your emotion, you can do it. No problem, right? And so you can't do that by anything described in physical science because they don't have a dualist model of reality, right? So how would they explain a person's ability to do that, right? And how would they understand it in terms of the physics of the brain, right? The interaction of neurons and physical matter and things like that. Well, they would tell you, well, we can't, but science is still figuring out, right? One day science will understand what's happening, right? And the reason I call it science of gaps is kind of a play on the term of God of gaps. Because here's what atheists do, which is ultimately just projection. They will always say, they will sort of make this claim, which is not what people who believe in God are doing, right? But they just kind of make this kind of nonsense claim because that's what they're doing. So there's always this projection with them. They will say that if there's something that a person can't explain, right, in terms of physical laws, they're just saying God exists or they're just attributing to supernatural just because they can't explain it. No, that's not what they're doing. But, that's what people believe, and they usually refer to that analysis as the God of gaps argument. So, for example, if I can't explain where the universe came from, oh, it was God, right? Or if I can't explain how a near-death experience occurs, oh, it must have been God, right? No, that's not what we're doing. Not only are we saying that not only are we saying if we can't explain it in terms of physical laws, it is true that maybe the physical laws just aren't true, but what we're also able to do is this guy. We're able to come up with a theory, and that theory is able to make predictions. And those predictions match up with our experience and experience of others. At least it seems to. And based on that is why we're accepting the supernatural. That's the framework you use for any theory you accept, right? Any theory that is better able to make predictions is always a theory you would accept, and you would throw out the old theory that makes less good predictions. That's science. That's what you would do for any theory. That's what always happens in science. Now, what the atheist is doing is they don't ever make predictions, and you'll notice that about atheists. When they make claims about these supernatural events, they'll make predictions up to a point. Up to the point, as soon as you get to the point that deviates from the dualist model, then they don't make predictions anymore because their theory always fails. So you'll notice that they just don't make any predictions. They don't have a theory that explains anything. All they'll ever do is just engage in denialism. Sometimes I call it learning by denying, right? They learned more about the event by just denying certain aspects of it existed. They didn't have to have a theory. They didn't have to make predictions. They didn't have to test anything. They didn't have to verify that prediction with other experiences. Again, I know they would say, oh no, that's what we do and this and that. I'm going to go over that in these points here. But generally, they don't make any predictions. There's always some point that they're going to reach, the point that deviates from where the materialist model deviates from the dualist model. As soon as they get to that point, they stop making predictions. They just magically stop. They don't even try anymore, and they'll just dismiss something as it didn't really. There's always some reason why whatever happened didn't really happen, right? And so they have this idea that people who believe in God are saying God exists just because they can't explain something. No, and don't ever let them try to convince you of that. That's what they do. They're just projecting onto you, right? We're not lazy like that. People who believe in God actually have a theory. That theory actually is able to make predictions, and it's a much more complete model. Is it able to explain everything? No, but it explains way more than the materialist model does, right? And so what atheists actually do is they believe in science of gaps argument. So when there's something that they can't explain, they will always go to the sort of the mantra that science will figure it out one day. There's always some future date where science is magically gonna understand something. Now here's the greater issue with this, right? Because that might not seem like such a bad statement. After all, there were many events in the past that seemed supernatural, and when we learned more about it, we realized it wasn't. So science did eventually sort of fill in the gap. But here's the problem. This is the problem with success. Sometimes success can actually kind of be your enemy with certain things. And it certainly is the enemy of the atheist. The problem is that it would make sense to use the science of gaps argument like in ancient times, in like 1000 AD or something, right? Because there was so much about science we didn't know. I argue that the more you learn about science, right, the less information there is to know, right? The less left there is to know. A rational claim, I can't prove it. Maybe there is an infinite amount of knowledge to learn, but I argue that the more you learn, the less is left to know about it, right? And if that's true, if you accept that claim, then I would say in the modern world, there is so much we know about science that it doesn't seem likely that there's just all of this information still missing somehow that's going to allow us to explain consciousness. We can explain emotion. We can explain near-death experiences. We can explain why people talk to God. That we can explain all of these supernatural events that I'm going to talk about in a moment. That it doesn't make sense to say that there's just this whole world of information. Sometimes I call it world of gaps, but I like to use the term science of gaps too. It doesn't make sense to say that there's a whole world of scientific information that's still missing from us somehow, despite all the information we know about science. That somehow when we find all of this magical missing information, that now we can finally explain consciousness. Now we understand how this works. No, right? That's nonsense. The more likely truth, right, is that as we learn more about science over the years and we started to understand more about cells or cell theory and germ theory when it comes to medicine, and we learned more about physiology and we learned more about physics, a lot of things started change. It's like a filter, right? So there are all these ideas we thought were supernatural, and as we learn more about science, a lot of these supernatural ideas passed into the natural, right? So just regular physical phenomena. But here's the problem. After all this time, there are still a couple of things that are left, right? That we still can't really explain, and we're really no closer to than we were back in the day. Sure, we are a little closer, to be fair, but not really that close, right? So for example, the consciousness, which I'm going to talk about that in a moment. It's reasonable to presume that if there are still things left that we really can't explain, despite all of the science that we've learned after all this time, it's probably because it isn't natural. It's probably because it's supernatural. So another component of this is if you've been studying science for a really long time and there's so many things about the physical world you can explain, then it's probably true anything left. So in other words, these claims are helped by time, right? Anything left over is probably left over because it's supernatural. But atheists don't think that way. They don't presume that, well, if there's something that science couldn't explain after all of this, maybe that's just because physical science can't explain it. In other words, it's not physical. They would say that, no. If we had a billion years to study, right, trillion, it makes no difference how long you've been doing it. No matter how much time we have to study science and learn about science, no matter how much we can explain the physical reality, we can explain them literally down to the we can explain it down to subatomic particles, quarks, right? We can explain it down to the quarks that make up hadrons or make up, I think they're called hadrons. or the particles of nature, right? So not leptons. We can explain everything down to that. The only thing really left is to try to make a theory that connects the three forces of nature, strong, weak, and electromagnetic force, that connects those to gravity. That's almost all that's left, really. Everything else is just theoretical, right? Like string theory and things like that. But after all that understanding, the atheist would say that, no, there's still all of this magical missing information that we still don't have for some reason. And when we finally find it, right, then we can explain these things. That doesn't make any sense. That's illogical to believe. In my opinion, that is illogical. And what it really comes down to is this point. Atheism at its core is simply a type of faith. That's really what it is. That's faith, right? That's like a religion, right? Sometimes it's referred to as scientism, right? Ultimately, atheism is just it's like a faith-based religion. Now, the term religion in many ways refers to, a kind of organized system of practices and things like that. You can make a claim that atheism doesn't really have that. It kind of does when it masquerades and pretends it's science, right? That's another thing I want to mention, is atheists will often do this. They will often kind of present their ideas or their faith-based beliefs. They will kind of present them in sort of flowery, sort of scientific language to try to make it seem more like it's a science and this and that. It isn't. And I've never been convinced by that for 1 second in my entire life, right? Because I've always been pretty good with science, right? So I'm not a scientist. Like I said, I think I mentioned before, I'm a science enthusiast. So I like science, but I'm not a scientist. But I've always been very comfortable with scientific ideas, so I'm not impressed by all of these terms that scientists will use. They'll throw out a whole bunch of terms to make it seem like their ideas are more scientific and more rational. That's another sort of buzzword they like to use. It's more rational, and I'm just going by logic and this and that. Like, no, please, right? Because the more rational, logical, and scientific approach, which I'm going to go over that more in a little bit, the more scientific approach absolutely says that there's supernatural and that there's a God. It 100% leads in that direction. I would argue to say there's no God or no supernatural is fundamentally the anti-scientific, completely irrational, and the lazy approach. It's just lazy. You don't even try to make predictions. As soon as it comes to making predictions, you just pretend something didn't happen for some reason and make up with some excuse as to why, right? And that's what they always do. And so no, don't be tricked or hoodwinked when atheists always try to color their faith-based beliefs in sort of flowery, sort of scientific language to make it seem more legitimate. Get out of here. Like I said, I've never been convinced by that. Always seen through it since I was a kid. But like I said, other people, it's still shocking to me even to this day that other people sort of buy into that. I've never done that. Never. Every time I've heard an atheist argument, like I said, since I was a kid, no matter how much kind of nonsense, flowery scientific language they want to try to use, I've always seen it as this kind of nonsense idea that is not legitimate. I kind of put them in the same category as flat earthers. I don't really see atheists as, I'm not going to say I see them as kind of like unhinged crackpots, but like, I just mean like I've never seen them as any more legitimate than how we consider flat earthers. I've always put them in that box, right? And no matter how much science they try to use, that's always what they've been to me, right? And so that's what I'm not going to say I kind of want other people to do that too, but I want you to really use your own sort of analysis. And I just want to give you these ideas to kind of show you that a lot of their ideas don't make any sense and they're false. And like I said, we're going to cover the second half of this in the next video, because there's more to say. But yeah, so ultimately, that's what atheists will always do. Whenever presented with some apparently supernatural phenomena, they'll fill it in with science of gaps, so which basically just means that whatever they don't know, they'll figure out one day. Doesn't matter if it's 100,000 years, doesn't matter if it's a million years, doesn't matter if they can explain everything about reality and there's basically nothing left. There's always still this magical piece of information that's missing for some reason, that once they know, they'll eventually be able to explain something, which is just a faith-based argument. It's not a scientific argument at all, right? Because a scientific argument would say, well, would actually be rational, right? If there's all these things we can explain, and we still can't explain these, maybe it's just metaphysical. Maybe we can use the data of spiritual experiences, which is how I did it, right, and to come up with a theory that makes predictions. They don't do that because then they would have to admit that the materialist model is wrong and that their and that their beliefs are wrong. So they always come up with some sort of nonsense denialism. So now to go into this guy, I want to now start talking about spiritual experience. So now I want to start giving examples. Spiritual experiences too, but I want to now start talking about phenomena that appears to be supernatural, right? And I want to look at it and sort of analyze it to some degree from these properties, and then kind of give you an idea of what atheists generally will say. And I believe that you're going to agree that what they say generally makes no sense at all. So the first apparently supernatural phenomena that I'd like to look at, and we already looked at it a little bit, but it's going to be the concept of consciousness and emotions, right? So this is obviously the most common one, the most common sort of phenomena that a person, especially one who believes in a dualist model of reality, would present to say this seems like a supernatural phenomena, right? And it has a property that we would expect of all supernatural phenomena. It has a property that it cannot be explained by physical laws, right? So how would an atheist sort of deal with this problem? And it is a problem, right? I should mention that in philosophy, I think philosophy or psychology, is called the hard problem of consciousness, right? So that's what that term is saying, is that it basically describes the fact that explaining consciousness in terms of physical laws, so it's actually not talking about a dualist model of reality, because it's really easy to explain consciousness in that model, right? It's just referring to the materialist model. Because in materialist model of reality, it is the extremely difficult thing to try to explain consciousness, how consciousness arises from matter, right? And so, by the way, the reason it's such a hard problem is because the materialist model is wrong, right? So that's why it's hard. But how would an atheist explain this? Well, actually, before I move on, I just want to make it clear, right? So we know that the brain consists of nerve cells and tissues and things like that. And all that's happening in the brain, no matter how you flip it, no matter how complicated the networks get and communication networks in your brain get and things like that, all that's really happening is just the motion of basically motion of ions, right? So I know you have nerve cells, and nerve cells are very complicated. Internally, the nerve cells complicated and things like that. But virtually all that's really happening, according to my understanding, I could be wrong, no problem, I'm not a neuroscientist, but all that's really happening is in terms of the communication network, is just the motion of ions across the cell. That's it, right? Ions travel across the cell. They'll send that can be used to transmit a signal to another cell, then they travel across, right? Multiple ions can communicate together, and that creates a kind of sophisticated network. But if you really zoom into any one ion, there is just the motion of ion. Who cares? Why would that? It doesn't matter how many connections you make, how many billions of connections you make. Why would it turn into anything that gives rise to awareness, any free will, which is kind of really amazing to me, but some atheists actually believe they don't even have free will, right? So we'll talk about that later. That's another one of the pretzels they got to wrap themselves in. They're clearly using free will, but they'll tell themselves, the free will I'm using right now is not actually happening, because that has to be the case in order for the materialist model to be correct. Now, to be fair, I'll give them a little bit of more sympathy with that, because sometimes things can occur in reality that aren't what they appear. But to be fair, that happens in science more or less with phenomena that is far outside the normal human perception. So, for example, quantum phenomena, right? It's possible for a wave, and it's possible for quantum particles to be both a wave and a particle. We're not talking about experience, right? I should be able to verify I'm using free will. But like I said, I'll just for the sake of being generous, I'll give them a little bit of sympathy with that. I still think for the most part it's kind of nonsense. But I agree it's possible that something might not be what it seems. But still looking at it from the perspective of the motion of ions in the brain, there's no reason these networks should give rise to free will or to experience of emotion or to the experience of awareness, right? So how do atheists explain it? Well, with the way they'll generally explain it, and I was going to explain here, but the way they generally explain it is they'll always use their favorite answer to this, which is emergence, right? So they'll always say, well, it is true that there's nothing about a single nerve cell, or when we zoom into a very small part of the brain, there's really nothing we're seeing there that would explain consciousness or emotions. That's true. However, when we zoom out and we see all of these millions or billions of connections, well, there's something going on there within the connections that we can't clearly hold on to. It's quite intangible, but there's something going on there that gives rise to emotions and awareness, right? We can't really see it zooming in, but if we zoom out and we're not able to look at everything happening at once, that's at some point where the quality or the property of awareness and emotion arose. And now here's the thing. Like I said, I've debated so many atheists and they always give that answer when it comes to emotion. And they always think that answer is a scientific answer. They always, because I'm always asking them, I'm like, how do you explain emotions then? There's no such thing as a supernatural, right? They're like, oh, or consciousness emotions. Oh, there's emergence theory. They keep presenting that like that's a scientific theory. That's not a scientific theory. That's a faith-based argument. They don't realize that, right? Is there science contained in the theory? I guess you could kind of say that because it's alluding to a lot of the science related to neuroscience and the brain and things like that. But the dualist model does the same thing. It also talks about that. It also says that the brain will impact emotions and the brain will impact your awareness. If the brain gets damaged, this will affect your awareness in certain ways. So why would that, the science you're appealing to doesn't really prove the theory of consciousness. All it's saying is exactly what the dualist model says. The dualist model says that consciousness is a metaphysical thing, right, that exists outside of the spirit realm. Outside of the physical realm. It interacts with your brain, yes. It is affected by your brain, yes. But it is not created by your brain, right? And that allows us to explain all types of phenomena that we do see, especially when the brain is near death, which we're going to talk about in a moment, right? But the materialist model doesn't say that. The materialist model says that consciousness comes from the brain. It is created by the brain, right? So you can't just use the same explanation that the dualist model also says. No, you have to explain, give an explanation exactly where the dualist model reality deviates. The dualist model reality says consciousness is metaphysical. You say consciousness is physical. Both of them say that the brain, the damage to the brain or changes in the brain will create certain changes in behavior. So you can't just use the same explanation the dualist model also says. So tell me the science that proves that consciousness comes from emergence. They can never do it. It's like exactly. So it's not a scientific argument. It is a faith-based argument. I hate when they try to present it as science. It's not, right? So whenever you hear that, just know that emergence is purely a faith-based argument. All you're doing is engaging in faith. You can't use this kind of silly nonsense about we're more rational and we're more logical and we're going into science. No, right? When the spiritual person and the materialist person see an event they cannot explain, they have to make a leap of faith to try to explain the part they don't understand. The materialist person makes a leap of faith and says, I can't explain it, but somewhere in the material lies the answer. The spiritual person says, I can't explain it, but somewhere in the metaphysical realm lies the answer. Both of them are engaging in faith. The materialist person isn't doing anything other than just engaging in faith no differently than the spiritual person. I hate when they try to pretend that what they're doing is more scientific or rational. It isn't. Nonsense. But yeah, so I wanted to say that now. But is that proof, because we can't explain it, is that proof that it is supernatural? Well, here's kind of how things work, which I forgot to mention earlier. When you have a theory, right, your theory makes a certain presumption. And if that theory is able to make good predictions and you are willing to believe that this theory is true, you have to agree to all of its presumptions, right? That's how it works. So for example, what's a good example? The Schrodinger wave equation, right? So the equation of quantum mechanics. The wave equation, it presumes that the solution, it's a differential equation, so it presumes that the solution to the wave function, or solution to the differential equation, when squared, right, it gives the I'm kind of going into too much in the math. It gives the probability of finding a particular particle at a certain location according to this differential equation, right? And now the inherent presumption in that equation is that matter, or the momentum of a particle, is, I forgot what it is. It's like the momentum operator, I think it's H over I, or minus H bar, with the differential with respect to position, or something. I think that's what it is, right? But the momentum operator, it presupposes that momentum is actually like a linear operator. So it looks very, very different, right? Is mass, yeah, no, it's including momentum. But yeah, it looks very, very, very different from momentum in classical mechanics, which is just mass times velocity, right? And part of that, I think, if my understanding is correct, part of that difference comes from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? You can't really know velocity is a function of position, so you can't really know velocity is the position. I don't want to say position operator, but it's the position as a function of time, right? And then divided by time, which gives you velocity. But my understanding, and I could be wrong, but my understanding is you can't know velocity, or you could just say momentum, that precisely at the same time you know position. So you kind of have to do things a little bit differently. That gives rise to the momentum operator. But anyway, I'm kind of going into it too much. In the Schrodinger wave equation, you have to presume the truth of the wave particle duality, right? So that's what I believe is included in that equation. Now, you have to accept that when analyzing the equation and sort of accepting its truth. You can't just say, no, matter doesn't behave like particles and waves. Matter at the quantum level can behave purely like a particle, but I'm still going to accept this answer. No, because that answer is describing things as if they function like a wave, right? You have to accept all of its sort of foundations as well if you're going to accept this theory as true. And so that's generally how it works. So now for my theory, I'm just saying in this case, my theory of the subconscious, I presume that the subconscious is metaphysical, right, in creating my theory, right? Now, if you presume it's metaphysical and you use that theory to make all types of predictions and you test those predictions, you're going to see that, there's all these types of things I could do with my subconscious mind, right? Now, is that proof that the subconscious is metaphysical? Not necessarily, but we can never know for sure if anything is metaphysical or physical. That's the whole point, which goes back to what I said about the standard for knowing something. We can never know something absolutely, right? We presume the subconscious, according to the theory of the subconscious that I set up, right? We can assume consciousness or the subconscious is metaphysical because that's the presumption made in the theory, right? Now, if you can somehow explain how the subconscious is able to do all these things that I was saying, and you can verify for yourself, without being metaphysical, then no problem. Maybe you can create a better theory. But until then, we have to accept the framework of the theory that says this thing is metaphysical, and that explains how it's able to do all these things. All right, so that's really long-winded. But I think you get what I'm trying to say. In the materialist model of reality, right, they could never explain like what I was talking about with the subconscious, right? Because my theory says that these things are metaphysical, and then I can make all types of predictions. Those predictions are very easily verifiable. You can see them in others. You can verify them to yourself. You may cause your emotions to go up. They go low. You can predict the timing of which they're going to go low. You can even when it comes to being in the zone, right? So I forgot to mention that. They still don't know they still don't understand in psychology or neurology or whatever how people are able to enter the zone. It's generally called a flow state. There are different sort of theories on it. They recognize certain principles with it, but they still don't fully understand how it works. You know why? Because it's a metaphysical phenomenon, right? So if you keep trying to explain it, right, purely in terms of a materialist model of reality, you're probably not going to be able to, right? Now notice what we did. I explained to you how that stuff works using a dualist model of reality, and I'm able to make predictions, and guess what? If you looked at chapter 13 and you studied it, then yes, you should be able to get in the zone any single time you would like. You can make predictions with it too. You can get in the zone with talking. I used to use it getting in the zone with conversation. You can use it to get in the zone with making music. You can use it to get in the zone with sports, whatever. You can use it to get in the zone with anything. You could control it at will, right? In other words, you have a theory, and you're able to make predictions with that theory and verify them. And other people are able to verify them through that experience. So it meets all the conditions of what we would expect of a supernatural phenomena. So what do they do in science? Material science, when it comes to explaining entering the zone and things like that. Well, they don't know how to do it. They can't explain it, right? And they still won't appeal to the supernatural model, which is perfect. It explains everything. I don't know if it's perfect, but it's a much better model than the materialist model in terms of explanation. So if you have a superior model, and this model makes predictions, and part of that model presumes that reality is metaphysical, wouldn't you just go to that because it makes the better predictions? Nope, that's not what they do, right? Because they cling, right, they engage in denialism, right? They cling to the need for things to be material. So, while clinging to that need, now there's no real explanation. We still don't know how people are able to enter the zone. One day we'll figure it out, which is just science of gaps argument. One day science will magically find that information that's been hiding for some reason, and they'll be able to explain how people are able to enter the zone. Same thing with emotion. So I talked about there have been many different theories of emotion throughout the years in psychology. There's never been a consensus on how emotions work because you can always poke a hole in all of them, right? Now, what did I tell you guys how to do? I told you guys exactly how emotions work. I tell you where, we're actually going to talk more about it next chapter. I talk about where morality comes from, why there's different types of morality in different cultures, even though it seems like it's fixed at the same time. You can make predictions about morality. You can make predictions about what you're going to feel in different situations. You can increase your emotions like this relative to any sort of, frequency, right? You can basically make any emotion feel a certain way in whatever activity. You can manipulate them at will. There's no way to do that in a materialist model. Doesn't matter how many pills you take or what type of pill you take, makes no difference. There's no real way to explain how you can do all those things that I've talked about and that you should have been able to verify for yourself, and you should have been able to verify that others pretty much seem like they're operating on the same principles. You can do all of that with the dualist model, but you can't do any of it or explain any of it with the materialist model. Could that just be because the materialist model is wrong, right? And you should discard it in favor of the stronger theory, which is the dualist model? But atheists don't do that, because then, again, they would have to admit that they're wrong, right? And so I just wanted to bring that up. So that's basically what happens with, consciousness and emotions, right? Till this day, they will still argue that one day we'll magically figure out, and all this information in science that's magically hiding for us for some reason will one day be discovered and we can finally explain it. And we're just going to ignore the much stronger model that explains these things because we don't want it to be true. Science of gaps. So the next thing I want to explain or look at is, this is a bigger one, and this is NDEs, or near-death experiences / spiritual experiences / dreams, right? So I kind of put them all together. For reason that'll make a little more sense why I did that based on what we talked about in chapter 10. So one of the other very common phenomena that are presented to atheists as a seemingly supernatural experience are near-death experiences, right? Like the others, they have the property that they don't seem to be explainable in terms of physical laws, right? And atheists will always wrap themselves into a pretzel to try to explain those ones, as well as just spiritual experiences in general. So what do they always say? So a near-death experience basically is when a person is just like it says, when a person is near death, they have some type of seemingly very supernatural spiritual experience. Sometimes they're extremely pleasant, right, when they're in heaven. Sometimes they're extremely unpleasant when they're in hell, right? But they occur. So how does an atheist explain this? Well, they really come up with the most nonsense explanations for that. One time, so they believe, let me just say, they generally believe that these are obviously hallucinations, because there's always some magical hallucination that happened at one time and never happens again, right? They believe it's a hallucination, and this person is just dreaming, right? They're just dreaming that they're talking to God. They're dreaming about all these beautiful landscapes and these beautiful angels. Or they're dreaming at some random nightmare for some reason, that when they're in hell and there's all these demons and it's super dark. It's just a dream. It's your brain coming up with it for some reason. So what is the problem with that? Well, there's a couple. So One of them is the intensity of the sensory experience, right? So, oh man, it seems like a waste of time to even say this, but I have to say it because there's people who believe this. How is it possible, right? Because when people have these experiences, when they are in presence of God, they say it's the most amazing experience that they've ever felt, the most intense love and pure love that they've ever felt, right? How is it that the brain is able to create these extraordinarily intense sensory experiences? When I say a sensory experience, I just mean it's very vivid, you feel it very intensely, and the feeling of emotion is very, very strong. It's from how it's described, and I've actually had it, not a near-death experience, but I've had a spiritual experience, so I kind of understand what they're talking about. The intensity of experience is so far beyond the normal sort of range of human experience, of sensory human experience, that it doesn't seem reasonable to explain it in terms of the brain. If this is coming from the brain, why doesn't the brain always come up with it? Why doesn't it sort of come up with these experiences more often, right? If the brain has the property to create this level of intense experience, why doesn't it ever do it? Why doesn't it do it sometimes? You know what I mean? At least sometimes throughout the day, right? And I should mention that, by the way, there are drug addicts, right? There are people who have done drugs, so they've done all types of drugs that increase their brain's ability to experience pleasure or joy. And as far as I know, I've seen a couple of near-death experiences like that. They all say the same thing, that the experience of God was nothing like the feeling of joy and pleasure was nothing like what the drugs gave them. But you would expect the drugs to almost kind of max it out, right? The drugs hack the brain so it releases chemicals so you can experience way above normal states of pleasure or euphoria, right? So if anything, if the brain has this ability, drugs gotta be, at least to some degree, able to bring it out if that ability is hiding in the brain somewhere. But from what we hear, they don't, right? These experiences go way beyond what you're even capable of, even with drugs. So why doesn't this happen more often? Why don't people sort of fall and get injured or something and then start seeing God talking to them and feeling all this love and see angels and something? And they're just walking down the street and they're saying, oh man, God's talking to me again, and there's this angel talking to me and this and that, because this is just a property of the brain. It's just an imagination, just an hallucination, right? In other words, it should be the case that the brain can become damaged in such a way where these experiences happen more often, or even a genetic birth defect. It should be the case that when a person's walking down the street, they always see God and they always feel this intense emotion, and they kind of feel it all day, and their brain is always imagining talking to God, and God is giving them certain information about reality, because that's what happens in near-death experiences. In other words, this doesn't make any sense, not to mention hellish experiences. And I've had a hellish experience and it sucked, right? So in the hellish experiences, they talk about seeing crazy darkness. The darkness feels alive, right? Well, not really alive, that's kind of not the right word, but it seems like it's aware or in some way. Why I don't use the word alive, we'll talk about later, and probably in chapter 8. But they see these demonic entities, they feel this intense presence of evil that goes beyond human sort of awareness. Like when I had my hellish experience, the amount of fear you feel is so intense, right? It felt like my heart was just going to explode out of my chest. Now, when you have these experiences, why is the brain creating this? Why does the brain just randomly do this throughout the day so if your mind is injured in some way? Where are all these intense sensory experiences hiding if the brain's capable of them? It doesn't make any sense, right? Now, I know the atheists will say, oh no, but there are people who say God spoke to them and this and that. But they're not experiencing the intense and sensory emotions, which I'm going to get to that in a moment, right? Because I know what they're talking about and I'll explain that too. But they're not experiencing these intense sensory emotions or these intense sensory conditions. That's what they generally experience when they're talking to God. That's one of the signatures of the experience being of God, and not just being some random thing in your head, right? Why isn't it that people often claim to experience these intense sensory emotions as they're walking around the day, or because they got injured, or oh gosh, I had another dream where God told me about reality again? That doesn't happen, right? Because it's nonsense. Of course it doesn't happen. There's no reason for the brain to malfunction, right, in such a way where it's putting you in heaven and you're seeing things more beautiful than anything you could have possibly imagined. And by the way, that is how it is, because I have seen I've had an experience, we'll talk about it later, happened when I saw Jesus. The way heaven looks is beyond human perception. You can't just imagine it. You actually have to see it to recognize how beautiful it is. And I didn't know that until I saw Jesus, right? I'm like, oh, the beauty of heaven is way beyond human perception. It's like trying to imagine a color you've never seen. You can't do it, right? But when you have these near-death experiences, why is the brain magically doing all this? For what? And why would it do it when you're near death? What's the point in that? Is there an evolutionary reason that the brain is for some reason, the body's about to die? Let me just randomly create the experience of this person being in hell, right? And I know the atheists will always say, a person was distressed. Not true. There are plenty of people who weren't distressed at all and had hellish experiences. Please. It's just another one of those kind of nonsense excuses they always like to give. Right? Or why are they imagining serene landscapes they've never seen before? Why not just imagine your home or something, or your best friend, or some childhood environment? Why are they imagining cities paved with gold and heaven and this and that and this extraordinarily bright light? It's nonsense. Why would any of this be happening in a dream near death? Presumably for some evolutionary reason. It's just absurd to me. It's like it's almost a waste of time. Or just imagining these demonic figures. When you're perfectly fine, you're not thinking evil things, these things just suddenly happen. Or you're imagining God. Sometimes God will tell people to write a book, right? Carrie Cohan, Betty Eady, Brooke Jones, which we'll talk about her later. He'll tell them to write a book talking about reality, telling them certain things. They feel much more lucid than ever, right, than they feel in a normal dream. And another thing that happens, in near-death experiences, they will also say that their mind was expanded, right? So they could focus on hundreds, if not thousands of things at once, understand things, recognize truths they never recognized before, put whole math equations together. That's what some of them think. People aren't even good at math, understand all these mathematical concepts, and that's a very commonly reported experience. Where is this sort of bandwidth hiding in the brain? Where the brain is near death, suddenly all these things become clear when it's about to die, right? The brain should be if the brain is near death, it should be so damaged that it should not be able to sort of think in a far more expanded way. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's not just, I know some people can take drugs and think with a greater capacity, but this is way beyond normal human experience. That's what's commonly reported in these experiences. How's the brain doing this? Where was all this magical sort of expansion hiding? Again, I imagine it goes way beyond what you can achieve with a drug. No one knows, right? At least they don't know, right? But all they'll say when you ask them that is, science is still figuring out. There's still so much we don't know about the brain. As always, just some excuse, right? When their theory and their predictive model fails, because none of these things should be happening according to their theory. Now, if their theory is correct, right, then their theory predicts certain things to happen when a person is near death. By the way, one of them is incoherence. And what I mean by that is if your brain is near death, right, presumably the organized perception of reality and of thoughts should break down. In other words, I should be seeing it's like a TV. When a TV starts to lose its signal, it gets distorted or pixelated. That's how reality should look for me if my brain is breaking down. Right? Everything should be pixelated. I could see some things here, not some things here, right? Why am I seeing amazing cities in heaven, right? Or, I'm suffering and hearing all these horrible screams in hell, and I'm feeling all this pain and things like that. Why would I be doing that if my brain is near death? Those are extremely organized experiences. People always say they're far more lucid and aware than they've ever been, even in life. Why would that happen near death? It should be the opposite. I should be hearing half thoughts and half, when people speak to them in near-death experiences, it should be incoherent half words that don't make any sense. It should be a random sound here, a random sound there. One moment the person's speaking, the next moment they're silent. Just things you would expect when the signal starts to be lost. Exactly what we see in computers or movies that, CDs that get scratched and things like that, right? That same thing should happen in the brain in near-death experiences, but it doesn't. That's, as far as I know, that's never been reported, right? Where, I was in the experience and, I heard half words and half thoughts and they were incoherent. This angel started saying chicken, dance chicken, or something like that. It should just be random stuff like that. But no, it is extremely coherent and extremely organized. But the brain's damaged. Its perception reality should become incoherent and not organized or disorganized, right? That's what should happen if the materialist model is correct. We don't see that, right? And atheists always just dismiss it like, oh, well, maybe, something about the brain we don't know. I remember I was talking to this atheist about that, right? And I was telling him, well, how do you explain the coherence problem, right? And he was saying how, even if the person is near death, maybe their brain is still intact enough that these experiences are still strongly coherent. And, he was saying how the network of the brain, the signals may travel along such a long path that's how they were able to prevent damage. And I'm like, okay, but first of all, that's still a faith-based answer. It still doesn't really go with the predicted model of materialism. But I'm like, okay, here's the problem with what you're saying. Is what that property of the brain, we don't see that to be true for any of the other properties of the brain. The ones that we especially know are physical phenomena. So for example, it is extremely easy, right, to damage your brain in such a way where now you're not able to, your emotions and behavior are affected, right, completely, right? Your body's ability to regulate your body completely changes. It drops or is just completely gone and you need some type of system to regulate it, right? Or your sensory experience is very easy to damage the brain and you just lose one of your senses, right? We do not see this type of resilience in the brain for virtually anything else that the brain does. But magically, the thing that requires the most organization from the brain, which is experience and awareness, that's what they say with emergence, right? The thing that requires so much organization and so many connections and such a intense communication network, or such a large communication network, which is awareness, emotions, and consciousness, that's the thing that's much more resilient than everything else that I imagine doesn't require as much of that. That should be the first thing to go away. That should be the first thing to break down. And yet, when a person is near death, it's like it gets more organized, more coherent. Their ability to think expands. They see all these bright lights. Everything seems more real than it did on Earth, right? Nonsense, right? By the way, I forgot to mention, that actually violates the second law of thermodynamics. There are different ways to interpret the second law, but fundamentally, you can just say entropy, right? It violates the law of entropy. It doesn't make any sense to say that when the brain gets more damaged, that somehow it's able to create greater organization when the system entered a greater state of disorder. That's nonsense, right? It takes the more organization you have in a system, you can imagine the more, how do I word it? The more organization your brain has, I'll just say, you can imagine the more organized the experience can be because of that. If the brain gets damaged, right, it's not the case that if it gets damaged, it becomes less organized, then it's going to be able to create greater organization for your experience and your awareness. That doesn't make any sense at all, right? Like I said, as far as my understanding is that violates the second law of thermodynamics, right? So that even violates physical laws. So it just doesn't make any sense. None of it really makes sense. Not to mention, there's two other things I actually want to mention about that. So another thing that an atheist will say is that, what was it? Another thing that an atheist will say is that, if near-death experiences are real, then how come they contradict each other and this and that? And some contradictions seem to be more Christian and some seem to be more Muslim or some more Hindu. And I'm like, okay, so first of all, this is what I was telling them. This is another one of those stars and stripes things they do, right? So I was talking about stars and stripes fallacy. Stars and stripes fallacy is when you place some random condition on reality and then make presuppositions or assumptions about truth based on the condition you just made up in your head. This is exactly what they do in near-death experiences. So you're telling me that if a near-death experience, in order for them to exist, right, if they're truly supernatural experiences, they have to show a certain consistency in terms of what you think makes consistency. And what I mean by that Basically, I'm going to explain that, but before I explain that, let me explain something very interesting about special relativity. Right? So if you're a scientist, you probably already know where I'm going with this. You know, in special relativity, what Einstein recognized in the theory of special relativity is that different people can all measure a particular object and all get different values. So, for example, if they want to measure the non-relativistic kinetic energy, they would all get different values of kinetic energy for this single object. So if this object is moving, you can have like 10 different people all measure a different value. And you know what's funny? As long as as long as both the object and the observer are moving at a constant velocity relative to each other, well, as long as they're just moving at a constant velocity, everything that each observer observes about the object is going to be consistent with their reference frame. So it's not like if they measure 5 joules of kinetic energy, one person measures 5 joules of kinetic energy, the next person measures 10, that the person who measured 5 joules is going to see something differently from what the person who measured 10 saw, right? And the object is going to appear exactly to be an object that has 5 joules of velocity. The next person is going to exactly measure an object that has 10 joules of velocity, 10 joules of energy, and everything the object does is going to be completely consistent with their reference frame. How's that possible? How could 2 different people measure different energies and everything the object does matches whatever they measured with their energy? How could it be both? It doesn't make any sense, right? It would seem to be a contradiction. No, right? What Einstein realized was that measurements are relative, right? Observable values are relative. In other words, they appear to change depending on the observer. Now, if you're an atheist, you would say that this object can't exist then, right? So if person A measures 5 joules of kinetic energy and person B measures 10 joules of kinetic energy, right? Then that's a contradiction. This thing can't exist, therefore this thing can't exist. Nonsense, right? No, it does exist. The truth the object is following is not what it appears to be, right? So in other words, I can't look at it and necessarily see the truth the object is following. It might look like it's just following certain rules where I can look at it, measure this, and get certain joules. It seems like that, but that's not what's happening. That's what Einstein realized. And we actually see that relativity in the physical realm. Are we to presume it doesn't also exist in the spiritual realm? Of course it does. And not to mention, they already tell us that in near-death experiences. What atheists will do is all those people who have these explanations about reality from near-death experiences, they just say, oh, they all hallucinated, they all imagined it, and it's all confirmation bias and this and that. And then they just dismiss anything they said as it didn't really happen. And then they'll go back to saying, oh, well, these experiences aren't real and this and that. Nonsense. So, in other words, I say all that just to say that when near-death experiences seem to contradict each other, that's not a guarantee that they actually are. In fact, we're actually going to talk about that later, because there is a relativity principle in the spirit realm, which we're going to talk about in chapter 10, right? The same way that people can measure different non-relativistic values of kinetic energy without it being a contradiction, is the same way you can have near-death experiences say different things without it being a contradiction. It's just a relativity principle of reality. Right? We see that in the physical realm, and it exists in the spirit realm. The truth that all those experiences are following may not be immediately perceivable, just like the truth of the object moving at speeds relatively close to the speed of light. It's the same thing. Like an atheist, it's like they don't think that. They think that can't possibly exist, right? They have to place this condition that all near-death experiences, in order to be supernatural, they have to have the same truth that I think they should have, right? If I say they're true, only then, if they say the same thing that I say they should say in order to be true, only then can it be true. No, could it just be that you aren't able to place a random condition on reality, and maybe they're both all true relative to some standard that you just have to learn more information about? Exactly what happened with special relativity in the physical realm. Of course, now you can ask them, if you ask them it that way, they'll make up some new excuse to say why they're not really doing that. Like I said, they're not practicing science, right? Science would say, okay, yes, maybe there's a relativity principle, maybe there's some truth all these experiences are following, even though they appear to be contradictory, and I just have to learn more information about it. That's what Einstein did. That's what Dirac did with the Schrödinger wave equation, to talk about relativistic phenomena in the quantum realms. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what science is, right? But atheists, like I said, they don't practice science. They just take it at face value. Oh, it looks different to me, therefore it's not possible to be real. Right? If you did the same thing with an object moving relative to the speed of light, you would have never discovered relativity. You know why? Because you wouldn't be practicing science. Right? So like I said, atheists don't practice science. So again, now why near-death experiences are different is actually something we're going to talk about, because I can even explain. I'm not saying I have the perfect explanation for it, but I do have a theory that explains that, right? And here's another thing about near-death experiences as well. They will always say, they always say this, they're like, well, if you're Hindu, you saw Vishnu in your near-death experience. If you're Christian, you saw Jesus. If you're Muslim, you see Muhammad. If you're a Buddhist, you saw Buddha. So everyone just sees what they believe in. That's not true. I don't know why they always say that, right? Well, the data doesn't show that, right? I don't know where they come up with that. Because when they say that, what they're trying to do is fit things into their materialist model. But when you actually look at the data, what their materialist model predicts doesn't happen once again, right? And when they see that doesn't happen, of course, they just make up some excuse like they always do. So first of all, most near-death experiences, and as far as I know, there are actual, who was it? I forgot, there was this guy who mentioned this. Yeah, so John Burke. So you can look him up because he actually did the research. He did the research on near-death experiences. Other people, I believe, have as well. And what they noticed was that, actually, before I even say that, when you look at near-death experiences, you notice something very interesting. Now, it is true that many people in some particular religion will see the figure associated with the religion. Now, not all near-death experiences have any religious figure, so many of them don't. But if you do have an experience that does contain some known religious figure, it is generally true that some person in whatever religion will see a figure associated with their religion. However, and this is what I was telling the atheists because they didn't realize this, right? You know there's only one religious figure, just one, right, who shows up in everybody's near-death experiences, at least in every demographic group, regardless of what they believe in. It doesn't matter if you're Hindu, it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist, it doesn't matter if you're Christian, it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or Jewish or New Age or atheist or whatever, right? It makes no difference. It doesn't matter if you're young, if you're old, if you're on this side of the world or that side, if you're black, it makes no difference at all. There's only one religious figure who seems to appear to everybody regardless of what they believe. And that's Jesus Christ, right? He's actually the only one. And like I say, you can look up John Burke's information about near-death experiences. He pretty much says the same thing, that the majority of near-death experiences that contain a religious figure, majority of them is Jesus. No matter what type of research you do, it always points to Jesus Christ. Like, in other words, the data, I'm not making it up, the data actually shows that something is unique about Jesus, right? It almost seems like, right, you have a theory about Jesus being real, it makes predictions, and those predictions match up with the experience. Well, I'll talk more about it later, because there is a place I'm going with that, but we're going to talk a little more about that in chapter 10. But suffice it to say that the data shows that there's something unique about Jesus that goes beyond just what people believe. Why are Muslims seeing Jesus in their near-death experiences? They believe in Muhammad. I know they believe in Jesus too, but they don't look at him the way they generally look at Muhammad, right? Why are Jewish people seeing Jesus? They don't even believe him as the Messiah. No one sees who they believe in. No disrespect to them, but no one ever sees this Messiah that they think is going to still come for some reason. They see Jesus, right? New Age people also see Jesus, right? Buddhists see Jesus, atheists see Jesus, like when they see a religious figure. And as far as I know, it's virtually never the other way around. It may be reported, but it's extraordinarily rare, right? Where a Christian who just doesn't have really any beliefs about Muhammad will see Muhammad appear to them in some near-death experience. Or they'll see Buddha. Or an atheist will see Vishnu. They're like, who is this? Right? I didn't even know who you were. That happens all the time with Jesus Christ. He appears to children who barely even have any beliefs. So the data shows that Jesus is actually unique. Something's different about him than every other religious figure on the planet when it comes to near-death, really, not just near-death experiences, spiritual experiences as well. This could be dreams, this could be supernatural experiences you have while awake, all types of things. there's always a uniqueness to Jesus Christ. And proving, like I said, virtually all the data shows that. Right, in any aggregate collection of data. We're going to talk a little bit more about collecting data because that is complicated for these experiences. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But virtually all the data points to the truth of Jesus, right? There actually seems to be something about him in reality that's true and that goes beyond just your random thoughts, right? But what do atheists say? They often don't acknowledge, like I've debated so many atheists and I'll tell them that and it's always like a shock to them because they were always convinced that, everyone sees whatever they believe in. That's not true, right? That's not true when it comes to Jesus Christ, right? There are many people who didn't believe in Jesus, didn't know him, and they saw him in their experience. And some of them are just surprised, they don't know what to say. Some of them will say, oh no, it's because they grew up Christian or because they were adjacent to Christian. Okay, then why aren't the Christians adjacent to Muslims and Jewish people seeing who they believe in? Why doesn't that happen like it's as often as it does with Jesus? Because it doesn't happen. If I'm in a Muslim community, I should see Muhammad someone because I'm adjacent to Muslims. Like it's always some excuse with them. Always. They always got an excuse up their sleeve for when they can't explain something, for when their predictive model fails. And it always does. And the last thing I want to mention about these experiences is that near-death experiences and just spiritual experiences in general with God, they deviate from mental illnesses. Because what will they say about these experiences? They're all hallucinating, they all imagined it, they all were on drugs or something, or it was all in their head, or they were all dreaming, and this and that, right? But here's what you have to understand. If this is a hallucination, or a dream, or something that isn't real, then it should follow what we generally see from hallucinations and from mental illnesses, right? Mental illnesses occur in a very, 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 very tiny segment of the population at any given time, right? On a scale of a near-death experience, where a person has these experiences with God and they see these angels and cities of gold and the most beautiful things they've ever seen and things like that. Why, first of all, why is this mental illness happening one time or this dream happening once, right? And then it just doesn't happen again. If it happens at all, we can presume that this brain is in some degree, predisposed to this sort of form of a mental illness. Basically what I'm getting at here is that these experiences happen to everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a child, it doesn't matter if you're an old person or middle-aged or a young adult. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, doesn't matter what side of the planet you're on, right? Since the beginning of time, people have been having spiritual experiences with God. That's not true for virtually any other mental illness or hallucination or whatever. There are particular factors that increase the odds of you having some mental illness, right? For example, it could be genetic, it could be you taking drugs, it could be injury, things like that. So these things, certain behavioral patterns will cause these hallucinations, where we see these hallucinations will generally show up in this group of people, but not others, because they don't have those factors. That's not true of God. He shows up to everybody. It don't matter what you're doing, right? It doesn't matter how healthy you are or unhealthy. It makes no difference. I was going to use a certain word. I guess you could say ubiquitousness. That's not really the word I want to say. But the ubiquitous nature of experiences with God does not follow the same predictive occurrence of hallucinations or mental illnesses. That happens in a very specific segment of the population and under very specific circumstances. Experiences with God doesn't seem to follow any of that. It just seems to happen with no real predictive sort of circumstances, right? So that's one difference between that and hallucinations, the thing God tells you. Another thing I told this atheist, right? So I was telling him how another quality of near-death experiences with God is that God, if this was a hallucination or something we were imagined or it was in our head, then why doesn't God ever tell us to do things that are bad, but we really want to do? We all kind of want to do certain things that are bad, right? And like when I say bad, I mean sinful. That will make more sense in a Christian context later. So for example, some people may want to watch I call them adult titles, right? So we'll talk more about that later. But you may want to watch adult content and adult titles and enjoy yourself and stuff like that. That is sinful and it is wrong. If it's right to do that, if this is my imagination, why doesn't God ever tell people who want to do these things? Why isn't it a common occurrence where God said, oh yeah, watch all the adult titles you want to, have as much sex with as many women as you want to, and have fun, just live your life, YOLO, right? You only live once. It's virtually never reported that God told them to do that, even though that's probably what they would want to do, right? Why doesn't God ever tell people to, oh yeah, steal from others and get as much money as you can, or live it up. Don't worry about me or having a relationship with me or trying to be a good person. Do what you can, murder people, right? Or hurt people or things like that. Do whatever you got to do to get ahead. Indulge, right? You can imagine if this is a mental illness, that's got to happen a decent amount of time. Especially when certain types of people have near-death experiences, God has to tell them that. By the way, that does happen with mental illnesses, right? People will report that some voice told them to do this and do that, right? When it's a mental illness. That's never reported with God. If this is just a dream or a mental illness, shouldn't it share the same properties as dreams and mental illnesses, especially in that regard? Why isn't God ever telling people to do that? Why does he always tell people the same thing? To act in love. Right? Why is he always telling people to love and have a relationship with them and this and that? Another thing is atheists will think that if, let's say I do see Vishnu and I'm a Hindu and I see Vishnu in my near-death experience, oh, that means that Jesus doesn't exist. Why? Why can't I see Vishnu and Jesus still be the truth of reality? Why isn't it possible that Jesus could show up to my near-death experience? He can show up to me as Vishnu. I think he's Vishnu, but really that's Jesus. Why can't that be possible? Right? So, of course, they never have an answer to this because they weren't practicing science to begin with. They were practicing stars and stripes fallacy. They placed some random condition on reality and said, if Jesus exists, he has to show up in every near-death experience and introduce himself as Jesus, otherwise he can't exist. Why? What is the scientific reason for that basis to say that Jesus can't exist in reality unless he does that? And then, of course, they never have one because they just made it up in their head, right? And they assumed it was true when they were analyzing the truth value of near-death experiences. So now you can ask yourself, why might Jesus do that? Well, if you actually listen to near-death experiences, God keeps telling us, you might have an answer. But usually they don't do that because they're too lazy. It actually takes work to do that, right? So I think that's everything I want to cover about near-death experiences. I could probably go on, but suffice it to say that near-death experiences are one of the worst offenders. They got a million excuses with them, right? And I remember, I was going to get into it. There was so I remember one atheist, he said, oh, well, I think his name James Winery, it's something like that. This guy who said that when pilots undergo a certain type of training, right, they can induce near-death experience near-death-like experiences. And I looked it up, and I'm like, of course. So there's actually flaws in that phenomenon too, which I want to read the whole thing before I sort of dissect it and show all of its flaws, because I'm like, of course there's flaws. And of course there's just some presumption they're having about near-death experiences that they're trying to sort of impose on other other phenomena. So this experience with I think it was high gravity or high G, something like that. They're like it's like pilots in a centrifuge, right? So there's certain experiences that they might report, which are saying, look, they have the same thing. No, they do not, right? But like I said, it's kind of a large report, and it's not that commonly heard, but I heard it when I was looking at one of these atheist arguments. So I want to go into it. But suffice it to say that a lot of these experiences, a lot of near-death experiences, right, do not follow what the materialist model says should happen, right? It doesn't do it at all, right? It deviates so much. And how do atheists explain that? Well, there's always some excuse, right? They notice how they don't even make a theory. They don't make a prediction anymore because they don't have a theory. What they say when their predictions fail, because they do have a theory and they did make predictions, those predictions just failed, right? And when it fails, they'll come up with some excuse of once they come up with the excuse, no longer are they trying to make predictions anymore. It's just, oh, well, it could have been this, and, one day science will figure out, or, oh, this person was hallucinating, or they imagined it, and this, and it's always an excuse. So I argue you can safely discard those. Same thing with dreams. Dreams virtually are the same We're going to really talk more, like I said, more about dreams in chapter 10, but they're virtually the same thing. But you can imagine that there have been many dreams that you've had that you're like, this didn't feel like a regular dream. Something felt different. It felt like there was some spirit in this dream, which they do enter your dreams, good spirits and bad spirits. And something is going on, which is correct, right? Now, if you ask an atheist, well, how do dreams work? Of course, they'll just say, oh, there's something in the brain that, as always, we don't understand and magically will be revealed one day. No, right? It is a metaphysical phenomenon. If you have a metaphysical model, you can... And by the way, we're going to talk about them later, right? Because once I'm going to tell you where dreams actually come from, because I practice actual science, and you're going to be able to make predictions. Like I've been able to make predictions. I make predictions all the time with my dreams. So, for example, we're going to talk about it later. One of the things that happens when you're coming to Jesus Christ is your demonic entities are going to attack you like crazy, right? And so you can have a prediction of what's going to start happening in your dreams just from trying to come to Jesus. And I know a person who did, well, you see them online all the time, but I know a person personally too who started coming to Jesus, and I expected that she was going to start having sort of negative dreams, but I didn't tell her because I didn't want to put the thought in her head. Sure enough, she had them. Same thing happened to me, and you see, like people talk about that online all the time, right? You can always so I can make predictions about dreams. I can make predictions about what's going to happen, right? And I do it all the time in my life, right? Where certain things will happen, I'm like, oh, I'm probably going to have a dream this way. And what an atheist would, of course, say is, oh, well, you thought you were going to have that dream, that's why you had it. There are plenty of things I think all the time, they don't enter my dreams, and that when I would hope to have some dream before, it never happened. I used to try to have certain dreams all the time, never happened. Please, they always got some excuse. But we're going to talk a little more about that next video because there's something else going on there about the theory. It has to do with the theory of epistemology. So, I'll probably try to get through these a little quick since the video is so long. But there's a lot of information I wanted to cover in this video. But another seemingly supernatural phenomena are miraculous healings, right? So when people have miraculous healings a lot of times they're accompanied by near-death experiences, and sometimes they're just like general spiritual experiences. How do they occur, right? The atheists will always say the same thing, right? Oh, well, we don't know for sure that it was that God did it, or there's just something phenomena we didn't understand. Science of gaps, right? Whatever I can't explain, science will basically fill it in later, right? And it's something that happened. We know enough about medical science. These doctors have enough experience to recognize when certain healings occur that just completely go against the norm, right? Something happened here that is very unusual and very abnormal. So it seems to fall under this category. It cannot be explained in terms of physical laws. That happens all the time, by the way. Near-death experience. It virtually happens every day, right? There are many people who will tell about give their testimony about their miraculous healing experiences. Like just in some off the top of my head, like Ivan Tuttle, I think he had an experience where I think he said something healed about his heart, which they said never happens. According to him, the doctors said this virtually never happens. I think has never been observed, right? It might be if it is, it's very rare, right? And they don't know how his sort of condition, his heart just spontaneously healed. Of course, in his near-death experience, I believe he was told it would be healed, and then it was, right? How could that be if it's just my imagination? What's his name? Dean Braxton. So another guy who had near-death experience in heaven with Jesus, right? He had, I forget his exact case, but he was very damaged, and I think he had a miraculous healing as well. Robert Marshall, 44 hours in heaven. So he went to heaven for 44 hours, he claims. Was told that his brain was completely damaged beyond repair, which is also what the doctors said. Then somehow it was just healed, right? He says all these people say they had the medical records for these things. Mary C. Neal apparently should have drowned. How could she be she was underwater for like a very long time and just should have been dead, but she wasn't. And so on and so, you can always find these experiences, right? Miraculous healings happen all the time. People who pray to God. We're going to talk a little more about that in chapter 10. What will the atheists say to these experiences? Even if you have medical records showing them, they'll say the same thing. Oh, we don't really know what happened. Maybe the doctor misdiagnosed it, right? We didn't have enough information, right? And somehow what they'll usually do is place the random condition that if God does do these experiences, he has to do it under controlled conditions for this thing to exist, right? So, which again, we're going to talk a little more about that component of it next video, because we didn't talk about that this video, but that's an important component too. We don't really know what happened. I can't just say it was God just because I don't know. But you're not doing that, right? You're going according to a predictive model. Right, but they're atheists, so they're not used to predictive models. When their theory fails, they just make up some excuse. But they'll say, oh, well, I can't say it's God if I don't know. It has to be a controlled experiment and things like that. And only then I can say, okay, what if God doesn't want to participate in your controlled experiment? He has, well, we're going to talk more about this later. He has a purpose for creating us, right? Could it be that the reason it seems like he's hidden and that it takes work to find him, could it be because he has a reason for doing that and it would go against that reason to participate in your controlled experiment? Could that be the case? You know what I mean? Of course they don't really care. They're just going to say, no, well, unless God does what I say, he can't exist. That's usually how they approach these things. So they'll say, oh, well, they want a person's head to be chopped off and then be connected again, and then they'll believe it's a miraculous healing. Stars and Stripes fallacy, just placing some random condition on reality in order for something to be true, just according to the thing you made, or according to the standard you just made up in your head, right? But yeah, so that's another thing that happens, which they just make up some excuse to deny. Another one, which is an interesting one, so this is one that I tell atheists about too, and this is another one that sort of shocks them. What's funny? Another seemingly supernatural phenomenon is the ability to move. Right, just moving my arm, that's supernatural, right? And it kind of makes sense because it doesn't seem like even if you take, now I know objects don't generally have the mechanisms to move, but if you take like a dead body, right, then that's not moving because it isn't alive. It doesn't have a spirit to animate it. Part of the obvious sort of behavior of someone who is alive and has a spirit animating our body, in a healthy body, is the ability to move. This is something you wouldn't expect of an object or a dead body, right? It tells you that something's different about this body, right? It has a spirit in it. That's a supernatural thing to do. And a lot of atheists wouldn't accept that. They would say, oh no, obviously, you're moving because of this signal in your brain being sent here. And this is what I always tell them. I'm like, so I tell them that moving is a supernatural phenomenon. And they're like, no, we can explain it and understand it without using any supernatural thing. I'm like, okay, then tell me what the first cause is of moving. Tell me the instance the signal arises to move your arm. Show me the experiment. They're like, well, we have lots of experiments about the brain, and if the brain gets damaged, a person can't move, or their motor functions are limited. This tells us the brain controls the process. I'm like, I didn't ask you that, right? Because the dualist model also makes a prediction about the brain influencing the subconscious ability to move, all that, right? I want you to tell me the very first instance a signal is sent, the beginning moment, down to the electron, if you can get it there, right? The first moment a cell or an electron or whatever changes something so that a signal can result in being sent across your brain and through your nerves and causing your muscles to move. I want to know the inception point of that signal, right? And they always say that I'm like, if you have that, then show me the experiment. Cite the experiment that shows me the inception point of the signal traveling. They can never do it. I'm like, exactly, right? It's always at that point where they realize, because they always think they know everything. And then they always realize, like, well, I can't explain that. Exactly. You know why? Because it's a supernatural phenomenon, right? Now, of course, an atheist will hear that and say, oh, you're doing God of gaps, where if something can't be explained, it must be supernatural. No. Once again, this fits in with the predictive model of the subconscious. And there's a consistency between everything I said about the subconscious, including the ability to move, right? All of it's consistent with each other. This ability to move and all these things the brain does in the materialist model, virtually none of it makes sense. There's so many things that just don't add up, right? But including that one. If we don't have free will and the brain is just sort of random motion of, not really random motion of molecules, but all of it is sort of automated motion in a sense, right? Then what is the first, because this is what I call it first, no, I don't call it that, but moving is a first cause phenomena. So a first cause phenomena is just a phenomena that, like it sounds, has a first cause. Physics cannot explain first cause phenomena. That's very important to recognize. That's one of the limits of physics. It can't anything that seems to have a first cause, it can't explain. Physics always explains it can explain everything after the first cause. Any equation that you give will describe some sort of behavior once you give it a certain set of variables. You have to give it those variables, right? There's some variables that you observe in some experiment, right? You can explain it based on you sort of inputting those variables or inputting something into the experiment, right? Physics can't explain something that doesn't have, it can only explain later causes. It can't explain the first cause, like the beginning of the universe. Physics can't explain it. It can explain everything about the universe after that first cause, at least, as it relates to the Big Bang. Can't explain anything before that, right? Can't explain free will. That's a first cause phenomena, right? Moving is a first cause phenomena. Emotions, dreams are all first cause phenomena because they're supernatural, right? In everything we've seen, it seems like first cause phenomena or first cause events are events that really can only occur by virtue of the consciousness, the conscious mind. I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But yeah, moving your arm is a first cause phenomenon. You just can't explain it in terms of physics. And if you think, and for the atheists, when I was debating, I was like, if you think you can, just tell me what the first cause is. That's all you got to do. Or tell me what the first cause of the signal that causes motion is. That's it. What he didn't realize is science doesn't know how the first cause, what causes the signal to arise, right? The brain has all this potential. I can do this, I can do that, I can do this, right? So that's potential. But no one knows why, well, scientists, I should say, materialists, they don't know why, what causes the brain to switch from a potential state to an active state. In the active state, it does something specific. So I could do this, or I could do that. So the moment I decide to do this, now it switched, my brain switched in some active state and sends a signal to do the active thing. What caused it to do that? No one knows, right? And of course they'll appeal to this nonsense idea of emergence, which is this faith-based argument, but none of it is science, right? That's my point. None of it is science. It seems like moving is a supernatural phenomenon. We can't explain it in terms of physical laws. We don't know what the first cause of motion is in terms of the signal in the brain. We know the brain is involved. We know that it sends us that once the signal arises somehow, it does send the signal, goes to the brain, it goes to the muscles. If your nerve system is damaged in some way, the signal can't travel all the way across, and then you won't be able to move, or you'll be paralyzed, or you'll have limited motor functions. If your brain's damaged, maybe the signal can't arise, and things like that. We know that. But in a healthy brain, we don't know what causes the signal to that initial inception point of the signal arising. We have no idea, never been able to explain it. And we can't because it is a supernatural phenomenon, right? So yeah, I already talked about the beginning of the universe. That's also a first cause phenomena. So I'm almost done. So that's the supernatural, sort of fallacy, right? This idea that there are no supernatural phenomena is not true, right? That's just you can present many apparently supernatural phenomena to atheists, right? All of these are pretty much seem to fit the standard of supernatural phenomena. If we have a theory and we can make predictions about these phenomena, which we can, and these predictions line up with our experiences and experiences of others, and they have this property that can't be explained in terms of supernatural law, and the theory itself presumes that these events are supernatural in the process of making predictions, all of that says that they're supernatural, right? So we can say they're supernatural phenomena relative to this epistemological standard. Remember, we can't know anything absolutely, which atheists always try to appeal to for these. But if we can make predictions relative to these standards, and they make much better predictions than materialist model, by that standard we can say they're supernatural, right? And so what the atheist does is every time all of their theories, their predictions fail, which they all do, right? They'll just come up with some nonsense excuse and fill it in with science of gaps argument. Well, even though that my prediction failed and the dualist model prediction was more accurate, I'll just say it didn't really happen for some reason. It magically didn't happen, and science will one day figure out what really happens. That's what they always say, which is faith. That's a faith-based argument. That's really very similar to what religious people do when, back in the Middle Ages, when they would say, when there would be some clearly physical phenomena, and they'll say that God did this or that to it. They do the exact same thing, right? In fact, that actually brings up, I forgot to write it here, it brings up something, a new term I created, right? So I don't know if I'm the first one to come up with it. There's probably some other term where a person says the same thing, but this is just something I've noticed, right? And like I said, I already recorded the other videos, so you'll see me talk, kind of allude to this in other videos, but I hadn't quite come up with the term yet. I now believe that there are two kinds of superstition, right? We normally use the term superstition to just sort of refer to someone who kind of attributes sort of metaphysical or supernatural causes to physical events, right? But now I believe there's two types of superstition. So that type of superstition is actually what I call supernatural superstition, right? So that's what people did in the Middle Ages. That's what people did in ancient times. When there's lightning and thunder outside, they believe the gods are fighting, right? So attributing supernatural causes to a purely physical event. Well, there's another type of superstition that I call material superstition. So material superstition is when you attribute physical causes to supernatural events. So these are all supernatural events: consciousness, awareness, emotions, dreams, near-death experiences, spiritual experiences. These are all supernatural phenomena. And what atheists do, and they don't engage in science, right? Because the science 100%, if you would actually follow science, you would most likely agree that these are supernatural. Just this theory, the predictions, this property here, all of it leads towards supernatural. It's just a more scientifically rational sort of conclusion to have. But what atheists do, they don't practice real science, they practice faith and just color all their language in science, right? And basically try to trick you to make it seem like they're more rational. What they do is follow material superstition. So even when their predictions fail, and the dualist model makes predictions that are successful, they'll just ignore it and sort of go back to their model because they don't want it to be wrong. And they'll engage in material superstition. They'll attribute physical causes to supernatural means, which is going to lead to a lot of problems if these things aren't actually physical, right? So I just want to mention that that's what atheists practice, and that causes all types of damage in our society. I'm going to talk much more about that later, because for us to be complete in life, right, we need God, right? And the atheists will always say the same thing: oh, there is no God, and people just imagine this in their head and just using it to cope with the difficulties of reality, which is nonsense, right? It's just it's material superstition. It's just a faith-based, non-scientific, faith-based argument based in superstition, right? And because people keep thinking there's no God and we can't talk to him and this and that, and they place all these random rules on who he must be in order to exist, right? It causes all kinds of problems for society, right? The society is never going to evolve to a certain point unless you have God in that society, which means being in most people's lives and having a relationship, period. It's not going to go past a certain point of development without God. It's impossible, right? So that's the theory, right, that I've set up, and we'll talk about that later. So they cause all types of damage for society. So the last two things I want to mention really quickly, like I said, because the video has been really long, but the last thing I want to mention is this kind of silly argument about some atheists will say, oh, when a person says God created the universe, or how did we get here, they'll always say, oh, well, who created God then? You have the same problem. Oh my God, they always say it's like that's some type of gotcha or something. So first of all, and I always, it's like so easy. Okay, God exists outside of time. Done. Right? It literally is that simple. I don't know why they think it's like this sort of big answer. Well, oh man, I don't know what I'm going to say to that. Not the obvious thing is that, first of all, the universe is here. So something always existed, right? It's not like if you don't accept God, if you say God does this, you now suddenly got around that problem. Okay, how did the universe get here? Right? Something was always here, whether it was God or not God, right? So then they'll say, oh yeah, but God is more complex or something like that, right? So it's more likely that the more simple thing, or universe, I don't even really understand how that makes sense. That the universe without God somehow is less complex than the universe with God. How, right? It's not immediately clear that God is complicated or how complicated he is because he's supernatural. You're talking about a physical complexity in terms of a physical universe. This doesn't really compare to supernaturalism. But anyway, they'll make that claim. And I'm like, but if God exists outside of time, then that's a perfect explanation. That means he always existed. Nobody created him, right? If you were to argue, now if God has free will and awareness, then it makes perfect sense how the universe came into existence. He chose to do it, right? Once again, a first cause phenomena. First cause phenomena generally require a free will. You can't explain them outside of free will, right? Many things I can do that I'm not doing right now, and when I do it, it's because I chose to, right? So God's the same way. Now, if you try to say that the universe existed before, there was some timeless moments before the Big Bang where time didn't exist, but it didn't have God, okay, but then how did the universe exist then? What brought the universe existence? Nothing should have been changing in a space where there was no time. Everything should have just been fixed exactly as it is, right? Only something that can exist outside of time, or awareness that can exist out of time, can create things or create time, right? Why would a universe that has no consciousness or awareness, how would it be changing in some way during this time to create time? Then it must have had time if it was changing in some way, right? I think you could argue, oh, it's some transcendental sort of thing that I can't understand. Okay, fine, no problem. That's a fair argument. Except where did all these guys come from, right? Where did all these spiritual experiences come from then? Because that's also, these experiences are consistent with the idea that there exists a being with the property that he created the universe. If there was no being with that property and we just magically popped into existence, you know what I mean, without, for no real reason, right? Just for some space that always existed for some reason, then these things shouldn't really be here, right? These things shouldn't really exist. In other words, now you might say, well, they're still possible. Okay, fine. But what we see consistently is that there are data points that line up with the belief that there was a God in the beginning of the universe. Because we keep seeing things consistent with that belief, right? We keep seeing things consistent with that reality. If there was no point to, which is what atheists say, which makes no sense, there was no point to anything and there was no point to life and everything was just magically popped up out of nowhere, then there's no point to anything. There's no reason we should be seeing any God say anything or telling us to love everybody and this and that. And like I said, if it was just our random hallucination, then God should be telling us to hurt people, engage in lust, and live it up, and things like that. So over and over and over and over again, you keep seeing experiences line up consistently with the theory that there was a God at the beginning of the universe. So like I said, but, just to say it again, if there was no God at the beginning of the universe, that must mean there was some timeless component in the universe. And I don't know how that ever switched to a universe if there was no time and there was no consciousness. It makes no sense. And what atheists will also say is, when I remember there was this one guy, so he was saying so some people talk about intelligent design. So the universe is so sort of complicated that it doesn't make sense to say that there wasn't a designer, right? And then what the atheists will say, I think I mentioned it before, was, then who created not just who created the designer, but they'll say, but God is far more complicated. So how does that sort of fix the problem? No, they're not saying that God is there simply because the universe is complicated. They're saying it doesn't make sense to say it got complicated without an intelligence. Obviously, that is what they meant. Like, I'm thinking about a particular atheist that I heard say that they will always come up with some bad faith interpretation or just some nonsense excuse, because what they're really doing is because they know how it sounds. They know that the idea of a universe existing in extremely complicated organizational pattern without a creator means it just magically popped up out of nowhere. And okay, how did the creator do it? He's supernatural. He exists outside of time and he's supernatural. He has properties that we don't understand and can't be attributed to physical matter. Done. Right? Now, for the atheists, right, they have to explain how the universe popped up magically out of nowhere and has its properties. If there's no supernatural component, where does it come from? Where did energy come from? Energy can't be created or destroyed. Where did it come from in the beginning of the universe? Oh, well, we don't really know. Science is still figuring out exactly. So in other words, what they're really acknowledging, and because first of all, this sounds completely ridiculous, but they always try to put other stuff on it to make it sound like it's not as ridiculous as it sounds. They want to make it sound better because they know it sounds ridiculous. What atheists really believe is that the universe just magically popped up out of nowhere for no reason and got all of its organization for no reason at all. It could have been anything for all we know, right? There's no reason for it to have had a bias toward this particular organization if in the beginning there was nothing, right? what made it more likely to be an organized universe versus a universe full of jello, right? Because we're talking about a first cause. There was nothing in the beginning, according to them, right? I say there was God in the beginning, but according to them, there was nothing in the beginning. What made it more biased to one thing over the other, right? And they know that's true. In their belief, you can either say that God was in the beginning, and yes, he had a nature that always existed, and he created a universe, and he exists outside of time, and he's supernatural, right? You can either say that, and that's completely consistent with all of these experiences. And I haven't really talked too much about morality yet. We'll talk about that in the later chapters. That's also consistent with the nature of morality. Some people will say, another thing atheists say, I forgot to mention, when it comes to morality and feelings of goodness and things like that, they'll say, oh, well, people, feel good when they give to others and engage in discipline and things like that because it helps people to exist in the community. And, we need these feelings to exist as a community and work together because it helps our survival. It is always... So anyway, I talk a little bit more about that stuff later. Because you can make that argument, but it's kind of hard to say now. You have to dissect it deeper. Because there are certain things that are completely inconsistent with that idea, right? Like, why does self-sacrifice, right? Even sacrificing my life for someone else. Why does that, to some degree, still feel like a positive thing under certain circumstances? In many circumstances, greed, lust, you know what I mean? Envy, all of these things should really help increase your survival and things like that, right? Now they'll say, yeah, but you can't work as a community. All right, then just make it very specific. Why do these things feel bad in every circumstance? Even when it would be advantageous to me, it always feels bad. There's no circumstance where any of those things feel good. Now a person will say, no, that's not true. They do feel good. And that's why we're going to talk about it later, because you have to examine it more, which they don't do because they don't practice actual science. Anyway, I just want to get that out the way. Fundamentally, what atheists always try to shy away from is that their fundamental belief that the universe popped up out of nowhere for no reason at all, magically organized itself to something that we just conveniently got material and matter and life from, and it did it all for no reason. That's really what their belief is. They'll put all this colorful language, and we don't really know, and we're still figuring out, and all this nonsense to make it seem like that's not what they're saying. That's what they're saying, right? Because they just know it sounds ridiculous, so they keep trying to make it sound like it's better than it is, right? So the last thing I want to talk about is the infinity regression problem. So I sometimes call it nested causes or infinite nested causes problem, but I think I forget which branch of philosophy or whatever it's called infinity regression. So what I want to talk about with this is something that I heard. I think it was Alex O'Connor, which I don't know if he's a hard atheist, but I think he mentioned it. I don't remember. It might have been with Ben Shapiro. He was in I saw a video, I should have looked it up. He was in some video, and he was saying how we don't have free will. This is amazing. So he was saying how we don't have free will. I don't know if he still believes this. I don't know how old the video was. But he was saying how we don't have free will because in order to have free will, right, let's say I choose to do this. There was something that caused me to choose to do that, right? Well, what was the thing that caused me to do that, right? And we don't know what it is, but we can, according to him, you can presume it was something that caused you to do that, right? Well, then what caused the thing that caused me to do that, right? And I could play this game all day until in other words, I have an infinite sort of series of causes until presumably I get to some first cause. And if I understand his argument correctly, I should have probably looked it up, but if I understand his argument correctly, he's saying that free will can't exist because you can't get around that causes problem. There's always some cause of a cause, right, that caused you to do something. I think what he would say is there is no first cause. You can't explain that in terms of what he would call the soul. I use the term soul differently, but he would call the soul. That is amazing that he would make that argument to me. Because it's funny, because he's actually making the case for why the dualist model is correct. He's actually making the case for why the consciousness can't be anything but a spirit or be supernatural. And I'll explain. I don't even know why he thinks this is true. First of all, right, what he's doing is the stars and stripes fallacy, placing some random condition on reality he's just made up in his head, right? Why does the spirit, if free will comes from the spirit, Why does it need a cause, right, for me to make a choice to do that? You're sort of projecting material conditions onto something immaterial. The physical realm is the thing that needs causes and doesn't just do things on its own and doesn't engage in first causes. This thing can never do anything without somebody else doing something first. If I poke it, that's why it did something, right? It didn't do it on its own, and it can't, because it can't engage in first causes. Nor can physics explain any first cause phenomena. The spirit or the soul is supernatural. It doesn't need a first cause. I can give whatever property I want to the soul or to the spirit to explain why it does what it does. It doesn't have to have the property that it needs a prior cause to do something. That's materials have that property. I can easily say if it's supernatural, it can engage in first causes. Done. That's why by the way, what makes this argument even more amazing is he pretends, how is the physical model the answer, right? If I do this, then what was, that's not, you don't have to explain that in terms of infinite causes, right? If I did this, then what caused my arm to do that? Oh, well, a signal was sent to my muscles. Okay, what caused the signal to be sent to my muscles? Oh, well, some neurons fired in my brain. Okay, what caused the neurons to fire in my brain? I can play this game all day, right? I play it all day, and either I'm going to keep going to infinity, which is infinite regression, or eventually I'm going to get to some first cause. And once I get to that first cause, what caused that first cause? I can play this game all day. It's amazing to me that he presupposes that the problem with free will is that you can't explain it in terms of a first cause. Hold on, let me try to say that again. He believes that the problem with free will is that it requires sort of, I guess, a series of causes. And eventually you're going to get to some first cause, I guess. And that's why it can't exist with the soul, but it can exist with the physical material. How does the physical material get around the first cause problem? It just has infinite causes, or you can just engage in the first cause? That's amazing. The only answer to that is the soul, right? Because the soul can engage in first causes. It doesn't need prior causes. I can easily choose to do something without any prior cause, because it's supernatural. The supernatural engages in first causes, and we see that consistent with other supernatural events. So I just thought that was unbelievable. But that's what atheists always do. They will always take some clearly supernatural event and try to Uno reverse it into something that they can claim, right? Oh, this is a material event. That's the complete opposite of a material event. The problem you said, which is why this can't be an event of the soul, is exactly why it has to be an event of the soul and why it can't be a material event. That was amazing to me, right? So that was amazing. So, I think it was Alex Cano, Ben Shapiro. You can watch it and hear what he said. That is just, but like I said, this is what atheists always do. Because they're not really engaging in science, they're just engaging in faith. It's basically just a religion. Like I said, sometimes it's referred to as scientism. Well, for scientists, it's referred to as scientism. They use all this flowery language about logic and this and that, but really it's just faith. It's not based in science, it's not based in logic or rationality, right? The logic and rational and scientific approach 100% lends itself toward God, or in the existence of the supernatural. So that's pretty much it. Like I said, this video was really long. I didn't mean for it to be so long, but there was a lot I wanted to cover, right? I just wanted to cover all my bases for this video, because I'm not really going to talk about this stuff too much for the rest of the book. So I wanted to put it all here in this video. In the next video, we're going to cover the second half of this, and we're going to now cover the topic of, kind of like, I don't want to word it. We're going to still cover the topic of epistemology, but we're going to talk more about the nature of epistemology as it relates to supernatural phenomena and as it relates to God. And we're going to talk about it more so in terms of the structure of reality, and another fallacy that atheists always engage in, right? Which is similar to what I was talking about here. So that's going to be the second half of this. And that's going to be, we're going to get a little bit closer to solving the problem that I mentioned before about how to know God when we start with this initial point where he's not well defined. But yeah, that's it for now though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.